Good morning, class. Today we will be talking about the ethics of equality, and then we will also be get into this a little later, an article by Albert Memmi, which is looking more specifically at racial ethics. Before we do that, why don't we jump into a little bit of busy work? I want to make sure now that we have firmly rounded our midterms and midterm grades, that we are staying atop all of our assignments and quizzes. It's definitely a easy time for students to start to slip off in terms of their participation. So I want to make sure, especially as we're kind of entering into this last home stretch, the next few weeks, that everyone is staying focused and on task as much as they possibly can. If things are coming up where you can't get assignments done, just remember I don't allow for makeup work, but you do have a full week to try and get this material done on a weekly basis. So try to make sure you're getting it done early, rather than waiting till the last minute, because usually that's when people fall into problems. If you wait till the weekend to get your work done, much more likely that something could go wrong than if you get it done early. Also make sure that we are tapping into the discussion board. Just want to make sure our participation stays as strong as possible. Definitely remember that you do get points every single week for talking not only to responding to the prompts I give, but talking to each other. So that's definitely a part of it. I also want to stress that if you have not already checked out the assignment for the paper, that you go ahead and do so. I haven't heard a whole lot back from that from anyone, which means one of two things. Either I did an extraordinarily great job in outlining what you need from the paper and what I'm expecting from the paper, and so it's so crystal clear that nobody has any questions ever, which, could be true. Maybe I'm great, who knows. Or it means that people just haven't sat down and looked at it yet. So make sure that we are looking at it. So if you do have questions about, what am I looking for, what sort of topics make good topics to write about, how do you incorporate ethical theories into these issues, which ethical theories to pick, etc., etc. If you're curious about that sort of thing, if you're worried about that sort of thing, please reach out and talk to me. Lastly, let's talk about, there's an article by Albert Memmi. We'll be talking about him pretty soon in this lecture. But he's just this really cool philosopher. He kind of set the stage for colonialism and decolonialism, and giving us kind of like a philosophical background for what that's doing, not only to the he has a very famous book called The Colonizers and the Colonized, kind of setting the stage for not only what happened to the people that are being subjugated, but the people that are doing the subjugation during that colonial era. So we have a very short article called Assigning Value to Difference that I want everyone to read. You can find it under the Assignments tab. Just print it out. Just print it out and give it a once over. It's only a couple pages long, so I'm not adding too terribly much to your workload in terms of reading this week, but try to make time for it, because not only is it going to be material you'll be tested on, it is just excellent material overall. All right, so when we're thinking about equality, the word equality, in terms of a social and philosophical context, at least in this country, conjures up certain images. It conjures up images of racial inequality, gender inequality, sexual inequality. It conjures up economic inequality, religious inequality, And while we are a nation that has been predicated upon certain freedoms, certain expressions therein of those freedoms, we also have a wildly checkered history of promoting all kinds of disparities in how those freedoms might operate and perform. For example, one of the dimmer points of American history is just looking at our interaction with Native Americans and how we have had this long stand. I mean, we all know the ins and outs. Well, maybe not all the ins and outs and details, but we have the general oeuvre of America's interaction with Native Americans, whereby through war, disease, expansion, division, creation of the Trail of Tears, and all these other things, we clawed ourselves a country at the expense of the rights of others. So, that sort of militaristic expansion that took place, leading to this manifest destiny that we ought to and deserve to control everything. Followed by then a century or two of mistreatment, where the Indian Education Act, for those that aren't familiar, was this sort of thing where we literally took all the Native American children and said, you can't be raised by your parents, and sent them off to boarding school where they would be raised to look and behave like white people. Flies in the face of normally what we would say is okay, especially from a standpoint of quality. But even though we had these sort of and then obviously the elephant in the room of the past of American history is our tenuous relationship with slavery as well. All that culminating in the Civil War. But not only do we have this long-standing history of unequal treatment, of racialized treatment, of prejudice and bigotry, whether we're looking at the Dred Scott decision or we're looking at the Jim Crow laws, we still have an inordinate amount of inequality being expressed today. And that's whether we're talking about the issues that are being brought to light by Black Lives Matters, which are not new issues. The Rodney King riots. Some of you guys may be a little too young at this point to remember all that, but that's where Rodney King was. It was in the early days of people just being able to walk around with cameras and film things, and caught on film this black guy in L.A. Being dragged out by his car at a traffic stop and then beaten by the cops. And it was the sort of spark that lit the powder kegs of racial tensions at that time period, and caused all sort of riots. And we see that today, like in Ferguson, there was, riots taking place over mistreatment between the black community and our police establishment. We saw this just a year or two ago in Baton Rouge. I think it was a year or two ago in Baton Rouge, where in the midst of protests, someone came up from the black community and then started shooting cops. But it all stems from this sort of issue of inequality where people are making this very legitimate claim that the way you are treated as a black person, especially by our police establishment, differs greatly from the way you might be treated as a white person. And to kind of expand upon this, I remember there's a reasonably famous story. I think it was Cornel West, um, because he's the chair of the Frederick Douglass studies at Harvard. Frederick Douglass was one of those slaves that got free and became a very famous published writer, an activist back in the 1800s. Anyway, so Cornel West was coming home, but after a long, international trip, gets to his house in Cambridge, and he's one of the most celebrated academians in this day that's alive right now, and he doesn't have his keys to his place, and so he's waiting for whoever has his backup keys to get there. The police come by, and they grill him and they arrest him, waiting outside his own place. And this is not in the ghetto somewhere. This is he's making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, well-to-do, well-dressed, but yeah, definitely gets pulled down and arrested, and because one of the people around said, "Oh, there's a black man in this neighborhood," and it was just this weird moment where it wasn't about wealth or appearance, but racism rearing a very ugly head against someone that well. If you knew anything about anything, you would be like, no, that's Cornel West. He's obviously not up to nefarious actions. But even the most respected and prestigious people within the black community are still under this threat of siege at times from the police. And that's why these protests and organizations like Black Lives Matter have had such a social force. Due to the fact that there's, it's not just Rodney King, it's not just the Ferguson decision, it's not just one video here, one video there of cops abusing their powers, killing people, but it's the sheer multitude of this sort of unequal treatment that has given this sort of resonance in our hearts and minds when we think about Black Lives Matters and other protests against this sort of unequal treatment. It conjures us back to those days of the free civil rights times where, we're telling people to sit on the back of the bus and use different water fountains. There's clearly something so unequal in these treatments between these two bodies of people. So it becomes a very, very tricky issue to look at today because it's not only controversial, obviously. We've had not only this Black Lives Matter, but we've had this response of Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter too. And not to weigh in on every single philosophical approach to equality today, I think instead it's just for us to sit back and take note of how controversial these issues remain to be in our times. We haven't even touched immigration, which remains to be one of the more reoccurring hot topics over the past 2 decades here in America. Not only the issue of immigration when it comes to our southern border and how do we handle the massive influx of Central Americans and South Americans, but further complicated by this renewed interest in national security, and how do we handle the immigration from places where some people in America feel produce unsafe people. So, turning it from not just an economic issue of jobs and services and goods, but also a kind of like racial issue, religious issue. How are we going to treat people from backgrounds and perspectives that we as Americans are not as familiar and not as comfortable. So before we get any further, and we're on the topic of racial issues and racial equality here in America, and we're not going to flesh all that out. What we are going to do is turn to me to hopefully provide us an understanding of what's taking place. Before we do that, I want to talk from our text, which looks at a basic principle of equality already. And from our text, we see when it comes to a principle of equality, it is unjust to treat people differently in ways that do not deny to some of them significant social benefits, unless we can show that there is a difference between them that is relevant to the differential treatment. Now, this is a pretty important definition, so I just want to read it again. It is unjust to treat people differently in ways that deny to some of them significant social benefits, unless we can show that there is a difference between them that is relevant to the differential treatment. So obviously there's a couple things at play here. It's treating people differently, significant social benefits, and then a difference that is relevant to differential treatment. I kind of want to unpack these statements because this is a very heavy sort of statement. When we're talking about, what is a significant social benefit? Well, that's a broad term that could mean almost anything. As I'll quickly talk to, like when we're looking at what does our society allow us to do, and what are the things we consider acceptable? Let's just go to something normal like buying alcohol. That is a significant social benefit. Not necessarily as significant as like voting rights or Social Security or anything else, but this is in a minor way. It's a significant social benefit. It's something that people want to do. It's a nice freedom that we get to enjoy. But it's not a freedom that we allow everyone to enjoy. It's not a freedom that we allow everyone to enjoy. So it is something that is granted to some, but not to all. Now, this is not necessarily to hone in onto the whole debate of at what age should people be drinking. But more just to look at this is a sort of social benefit. But when we think about who do we not let drink, it might be a little bit tenuous to say, oh no, it's unfair for 18s and 19s and 20-year-olds to drink, especially the main argument is that, you can go serve your country and kill people and join the military at 18, but you can't drink alcohol because you're not responsible enough for that. But let's go a little bit more drastic. An 8-year-old. We deny 8-year-olds the social benefit of the ability to purchase alcohol. And we have to ask ourselves, would this violate a principle of equality? And most of us would end up saying, no, that does not. Because even though we are treating people differently, and we are denying them a significant social benefit, we probably would agree that we can show that there is a difference relevant to that differential treatment. So we're saying to ourselves, we're not going to let a kid drink alcohol because we understand that an 8-year-old has a sort of different biochemistry from a 22-year-old. And the way a drink or a beer can affect a 22-year-old is very different and harmful by contrast to how it's going to affect an 8-year-old. And because there is this sort of difference in affect of alcohol between an 8 and a 22-year-old, we argue that it is not treating them unjust to deny them that. Now, if we were to look at something else a little differently, like let's say coloring with markers. Is there something inherent in coloring with markers that would make sense to say an 8-year-old cannot do this in the same way a 22-year-old can do this? Is there a difference that would be relevant to that sort of differential treatment? And as far as I can stretch my mind and think of any possibilities or contingencies, I would say that no, there's probably not a difference relevant to the differential treatment between the way an 8-year-old uses a marker and the way a 22-year-old uses a marker that is in any way correlative to the difference in how alcohol would affect an 8-year-old and a 22-year-old. So, in the case of in the case of drinking alcohol, we can say that denying them that significant social benefit seems warranted, predicated upon the idea that there is a real difference that is relevant to this sort of differential treatment versus coloring with markers does not seem to carry as much weight. We cannot as firmly establish a differential treatment that is relevant enough to deny an 8-year-old the ability to color with markers. I know that seems like a kind of silly example, but when we're talking about stuff that does have a lot more nuance, then it becomes a much more difficult issue to parse out. So at least with our examples, we can start to look at something clear, because it very quickly can become a sort of, I don't want to say slippery slope, but more of muddy waters of when is it okay to deny someone significant social benefit. Great example would be something like the care of the elderly. Because there is a sort of nebulous line when someone through either Alzheimer's or dementia or the lack of ability to self-direct loses this sort of significant social benefit of being in control of their own life, being able to make decisions for themselves, whereupon like an attorney, guardian of the estate, or their children take upon that position. But that's not clearly defined. It's not clearly defined when that should occur, because in every case it's a little bit different. But we do have a moment, a transition, where at one point we cannot in good faith deny someone the social benefit of power of your own property and self, and then the next moment we do. So when we're looking at like these sorts of liminal stages between someone who is of sound mind and body and someone who is not of sound mind and body, it's not very clear cut exactly when that transition point can happen. Now there are legal criteria, but it's still the type of thing that is the reason we have legal criteria, is because it's so not obvious. It's so, as I said, muddied for when that point actually takes place. And this is a challenge. This is a challenge for us when we're thinking about equal treatment and what does and does not violate this principle of equality. So I say here, let's turn this principle back to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which hopefully you guys are, well, if you guys follow politics, was a pretty big deal, and continues to remain a sort of big deal. It's one of these acts where, it's allowing people to treat each other differently based on religious stipulations, like the baker and the baking of wedding cakes. He doesn't have to bake for gay and lesbian couples because they don't see that sort of marriage as a viable thing. Um, and what we have here is this question: when should we be allowed to treat people differently, to deny them the social benefits, i.e., being able to walk into a bakery and make a purchase? And when are we able to show that there is a difference relevant to this sort of differential treatment? Is religious preferencing, religious freedom, quote unquote, a necessary justification that makes relevant treating people differently? And this has been, this sort of renewal of ways of exclusion. In a certain way, we think back to, again, the way some of these exclusive criteria looked during the Civil Rights Movement, where, Jim Crow laws were like, no, you have to eat it, you don't get to come in through the front door of restaurants. You don't get to drink from the same water fountains. You don't get to go in the same parts of town. You can't swim in the same pools. We set up racial criteria that would outline and govern all various aspects of life, and create a sort of differentializing factor between all sorts of people here in America. And things like this Religious Freedom Restoration Act are, and again, a kind of like renewed attempt at doing that. Except it's approaching it not from a racial perspective, but a religious perspective. And does that allow us? Give us a viable reason to treat people differently? And it's a tough question because it's called a Freedom Act because it's saying people should be allowed to pursue religious freedom to whatever consequence there might be, even if that means treating people differently, violating this principle of equality. But what all of these issues and the other current issues that we discussed earlier are kind of hearkening back towards is that we still haven't answered socially this basic question: is there a right to treat people differently? And if we're going to be defending rights, whose rights should we be defending? The rights of those that are being treated differently, or the right for people to treat each other differently? And then this is kind of my preview of what we're going to be looking at next week, which is looking at economic inequality. Is what is the larger social economy and what is the larger political economy? How are these issues being tied back to issues of wealth and power? How are these issues being tied back to issues of control and governance? Because some people like Marx would end up saying that all of these sorts of social issues, these cultural issues, have at their root a base of economic and governmental power. So I want us to turn our attention away from this basic principle of equality. Keep this in mind, because I want to look at another principle, which is Albert Memmi and what he describes as racism. Because Memmi for us gives us not just a description of racism that starts and begins with, oh, I don't like people of a different skin color. Because, he goes off so much further than that, because as a philosopher who was living in Algiers, everyone had the same skin color. But the sort of racism that he observed was a racism between Jewish people, Islamic people, and Christian people. And that even though we had this community where everyone has the same physiological physiological manifestations, the same ears, same skin color, eyes, nose, whatever else. We don't have this sort of, oh, it's white thing, it's a black thing. No, it wasn't necessarily about race in this sort of limited, what is the color of your skin, this is who you are as a race, because that's, even though that's the American way, that's for the most part not actually the way the rest of the world sees racism. Most people are seeing it as something far beyond skin color. And so he, not having that sort of conventional, oh, look at you, you have, more melanin in your blood, in your skin, therefore I'm going to treat you poorly. No, he's not looking at racism from that perspective. Instead, he's looking at racism as a driving social mechanism for reinforcing existing order, which is, again, at that time and place, oppression of the Muslim population over the preference of the Christian population, with the Jews being this sort of like weird third wheel to all of that. So this is what he has to say about racism, and we're going to unpack his statement a little bit here, but what he argues is that racism is not, like I said, this sort of, oh, I don't like people of other skin color. It's no. Racism is the generalized and final assigning of values to real or imaginary differences to the accuser's benefit and at his victim's expense in order to justify the former's own privilege or aggression. Again, I'm going to just reread this. Racism is the generalized and final assigning of values to real or imaginary differences to the accuser's benefit and at his victim's expense in order to justify the former's own privileges or aggression. So there's a lot going on in this statement. Racism is a generalized and final assigning of values. What does it mean to assign a value? Because some things, from a sort of Greek perspective, there are items which have value in of themselves. But that's a very outdated, outmoded. I mean, there's not. I don't want to sit there and say outmoded. There's still a lot of this, the thing in itself that actually drives value. But thinking back to the movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. I don't know if anyone ever saw this. It starts off with this plane is flying over middle of nowhere Africa. And this guy tosses a Coke bottle of Coke. Tosses a bottle of Coke out the window. And it gets picked up by a tribesman. Now, this is garbage. But to the people that have never seen this sort of like glass, this sort of glass bottle that can do all sorts of crazy stuff, you can use it to hit someone. You can use it to make noise by blowing on it. You can use it as a tool, and so this glass bottle, even though it may not be something that we would say has value in of itself, because it's just trash that someone's tossing out of a plane, actually takes on all sorts of value to the tribe. And this is what I'm trying to describe here is the mutability of value in today's, in terms of not today's reality, but all reality. Value is what value you can give it. An item, a thing, a person has value in as much as those values are recognized and accepted by the society that thing, object, person might be a part of. They are not necessarily inherent per se in nature. So when he says racism is the generalized and final assigning of values, he's talking about our ability to impart value that either isn't there or isn't there already, by virtue alone of value. Now, when he says it's generalized, that means it's lacking specificity, and we can think back to And think back to the sort of weirdness by which we look at, like, let's say, Mexican immigration. We have these generalizations, these stereotypes that exist, even when they're completely contradictory. Like, for example, we say to ourselves, all them lazy Mexicans. And you're like, okay, all the lazy Mexicans that are taking all of the jobs. And so we have these two generalized, stereotypical, bigoted values that we're saying about this people group that are entirely contradictory. You can't be both lazy and industrious at the same time. You can't be taking all the jobs due to your sloth. That's like saying, they're dominating a financial industry through their poverty. Like, doesn't make any sense at all. So what we have and what we see is that racism is when we take these sort of non-specific, these generalized values. We start to stereotype people based on generalizations that may not make sense whatsoever. And more than just being generalized, we say that they're finalized. And by being finalized, what we're saying here is that this is no longer up for debate. Because once you've entered into the apparatus of a racialized system, we make it seem like these values are eternal, inherent, not something that we can sit there and argue about. Like, there's a moment when Britain and India were interacting, and well-known British lord was writing about his experiences in India, and he said, the whole library of Indian literature is not worth as much as a single bookshelf in a British house. A single shelf of books. Everything that had ever been written by all of India's culture, the Bhagavad Gita, all the Buddhist teachings, all the Hindu teachings, everything, like hundreds of thousands of millions of pages and stories. And I don't know if you guys are familiar, they had this pantheon of gods in India that far exceeds even like the Roman pantheon. So they had this rich mythology. This guy says, I'm just speaking finally, that not a single thing they've written is worth near as much as a single book or a single shelf of books in a British library. This is how you finalize these values. It's not up for debate. It's not up for discussion. And anyone who challenges it becomes pariah. But yes, it's these generalized and final assigning of values for real or imaginary differences. So, when we're talking about real and imaginary differences, when it comes to a sort of racist ideology, there are real differences, obviously, expressed phenotypes, because I know between the different races here in the world. Because I know if any of us did science back in high school, hopefully remember a Punnett square, where you can look at homozygous and heterozygous chromosome traits. And so if you got a person with brown eyes, they could have gene traits for one brown, one blue, and so you could have kids with blue eyes even though both parents have brown eyes, and vice versa. And so you have this sort of like, there are real differences between the way genetic code is expressed in individuals. Like, again, the whole melanin in skin is a very obvious one. And the sort of like evolutionary adaptations that has taken place by this sort of real difference. The ability to withstand like different amounts of sunlight. Obviously, I'm one of the paler people that you guys will come across, and I crisp up like a lobster. If you put me outside in the sun for 5 minutes. That is a real difference. Now, what we need to keep in mind is that we are talking about a generalized and final assigning of value to real difference. Even though there's a difference, that difference doesn't mean that there's any value inherent in that difference. It's only through the process of assigning value to that difference do we start to see what that difference actually means. And here in America, given our Jim Crow laws and the sort of like troubled history that we have, there was a lot of time where we said, okay, the value of that real difference is not, he cannot stay in the sun as long as other people. Instead, whiteness was a sign of being superior to other people. And so, even though there is a real difference between how much melanin I have in my skin and how much melanin other people have in their skin, the value of that difference is what was fabricated. Now, we also have imaginary differences, and this is how racism is further complicating itself. Imaginary differences between our sort of people groups. Imaginary differences like where we start to say that there's a nature of these different races. Like if you guys remember Linnaeus's early classification system, this is where we get kingdom, phylum, genus, species type stuff, kingdom, order, family. And he said, there's these subtypes of people. And the white people are people with characteristics of leadership and intelligence and honor. And Asiatic people are characters of, thriftiness and commerce. And Native American people are people of bravery and savagery. And you're just like, where did you come up with that, buddy? And again, it's this sort of like imaginary differences that he's creating in that moment that suit this sort of like racialized ideology. And none of it is actually necessarily rooted in reality. So not only do we have real differences that are being given these sorts of value systems, but they have imaginary differences that are being given value systems as well. And you may ask, well, why would we even do this? Why are we putting these value systems into place at all? And Mimi says, this goes to the accuser's benefit and at his victim's expense. So the person getting to set the terms of value is going to be benefiting from them. And the person who is suffering this sort of thing is in fact the victim. And this is very much what we start to see play out. Whether we're talking about, like, again, the Jim Crow laws, or we're talking about colonialism, but we're talking about reasons that are being given to justify the exploitation that is taking place at political and social levels. So, when we're saying, okay, that whole Indians don't have any good books ever sort of thing that Macaulay was talking about, what it actually is being used to justify is the destruction of all the churches and teaching centers to be reconstituted as British churches and British teaching centers. We're eradicating one religion and one educational system to put in place a British religious system and a British educational system. And so, in order to justify that sort of behavior, to sell it, we have to denigrate the Indians and everything that they have accomplished. So this is where you see it's not necessarily the assigning of values for no reason, but no, it's a value system that's being created with a very specific reason, to the benefit of those that are accusing and the justification of privilege. So what Mia is talking about here is a sort of political and social economy, an order of thinking, an order of existence that is being driven by racism and is manifested as generalized and assigning of values to real and imaginary differences at the benefit of those that get to make those claims, and at the expense of those that continually suffer these claims. So this is much more than just our normal expression of, oh, you don't like someone because their skin color is different. Oh, they talk funny. Oh, they're not from around here, and so you tease them. That's a very, I'm not saying that's not racism, because that's all sorts of bigotry. But what Mimi is doing here is bringing in the political and the social. And to say, let's look at the bigger picture of what is taking place when we're thinking about racism and equality. And we're thinking about racism and equality here in America. It's not necessarily something as whimsical or as simple as skin color and not liking people from a certain skin color. Instead, it's actually this sort of complicated narrative that we're telling ourselves for the preservation of privilege and power. Now, where this comes back into, as I've said before, kind of the second half of this semester, we're looking at how these sorts of large-scale differences or these new ethical theories push back against some of the traditional ethics that we've been talking about. And where this comes into play, especially in the Western tradition, is this issue of racial equality, ethics, and colonialism. Because while we're looking at some of the Greeks, and we're looking at these theories of virtue, etc., etc. This is all taking place. You got to remember, Aristotle's all taking place of his little virtue thing, while Alexander the Great is like pillaging and murdering the rest of the world in conquest. And once he's done, because he perishes, and his generals take over. Some of their reign is so brutalizing and thorough that they destroy the gods of all these other cultures and churches and temples, and they're so mean that rebellion is fomented all across the empire within a couple hundred years. And so what we have here is this ethical system praising virtue. At the same time, we have a functioning world system that is praising power. And the two are having very little to do with one another. Then when we think about the British in the 1700s, and the British in the 1700s were so thoroughly known for the expansive British Empire that was oftentimes, we're talking about utilitarianism, the greatest happiness principle, but what was being excluded from the greatest happiness principle is any consideration for the massive amounts of suffering that's taking place in order to prop up the British Empire. So, in Britain, we can have these wonderful, lovely debates on, when are we going to achieve the most happiness for the most amount of people, and John Stuart Mills and Bentham, we're working through hedonism, and on the other hand, we have all this sort of like empiricism and John Locke, but the entire system is being propped up by the exploitation of wealth, the exportation of wealth, and massive amounts of human suffering. And so it almost in some ways kind of seems a little bit hollow. That we are finally having all these sorts of wonderful ethical conversations while untold savagery is being committed. Like for example, and I'm not just trying to be like, oh, white people are the worst, that sort of thing. Concrete examples of what's taking place is that, like in Manchester, you see this boom of the textile industry taking place. And a lot of that comes straight from the revamping of the British Empire over India. Well, what had happened in India was that they had their own textile manufacturing centers, and in order to foster British growth, what they did was they would buy the cotton from India and the silks and everything else. You got to remember, Britain really only had wool at that time. Um, they would buy the rough fabric, and instead of using the Indian people to process through textile manufacturing, they actually started burning all the factories, and they started cutting off the thumbs of all the weavers. Because, you can't weave if you don't got no thumbs. So they were going around cutting off the thumbs of all these weavers and then sending all those raw materials back to Britain, developing their own manufacturing centers, and then selling those goods across the world. So we had literally the stripping of not only raw materials, but of thumbs, to destroy the sort of economic livelihood of certain individuals, for the benefit of these wonderful British people who are then talking about, hey, utilitarianism, let's make as many people as happy as possible, and that's what it means to be good. All the while, all these other people are sitting there, waving their stump thumbs around. There's something incongruous with this. There's something wrong with this. And the story goes on, where we're looking at Germans, where we're looking at Americans. It doesn't take long to look into these histories to see that, while we're having these great philosophical debates, there's something thoroughly rotten to the core. And this is why when we're talking about these theories of equality, theories of racial equality, we see that there's a certain element that's pushing back against our traditional Western philosophies. Something that's pushing back against the way we have conceptualized having these great debates. The sort of reality that's underpinning these loftier discussions. I'm going to leave you guys with that. Kind of a grim note, talking about the thumbless weavers. But I hope you guys have a great day. Make sure we get our assignments done. If you have any questions about the paper, feel free to shoot that over to me as soon as you can. All right. Take care.